Hi everyone, good evening. It's Jonathan Bourke here from Elmhurst Energy. Thank you very much indeed for coming along this evening. And thank you also to you, Julie, for the very kind invitation. As you can see on screen, I'll hope to give an overview this evening of PAS 2035 with a particular focus on some of the roles and responsibilities within it. As well as touching upon that, I'll also look at the implementation and what's on the horizon in terms of the way that PAS 2035 is likely to become more commonplace out there, initially through public sector procurement and then ultimately looking towards the owner-occupied and able to pay side of the marketplace, together with various services that are on offer from Elmhurst to be able to support people who are looking to become more and more involved in the process. Many of you will be familiar with Elmhurst, but for those of you who aren't, you'll all be familiar with energy performance certificates. As you know, that's a legal requirement whenever a property is bought, sold, rented out or constructed within the UK. And that's very much the history of Elmhurst. We are the UK's leading approved organisation, as we call it in Scotland, or accreditation scheme, as it's called elsewhere in the UK, with around about 7,500 energy assessors between non-domestic, domestic and on construction. We are part of the FENA group, which is an international consortium, would you believe, of companies who each specialise in a particular area of testing, inspection, certification and compliance. And a bit of confirmation there on screen of the size of the market share. Elmhurst currently has over 50% of all EPCs of all types lodged across the UK sent through our systems. Okay, but PAS 2035 is a relatively new area for us to have become involved in. As you'll see when we expand on some of the roles, some of them fit perfectly with a lot of the roles currently occupied by various energy assessors and competent persons who are already accredited through Elmhurst. But I'll also look at some of the opportunities there are for other people to become involved. But first off, what is PAS 2035? Well, the PAS stands for a publicly available specification. So essentially the PAS is a document. PAS 2035 is a document that's been produced by the BSI, which acts as an overarching document for the standards for the domestic retrofit of energy efficiency measures within a property. It very much focuses on a whole building approach, and I will touch upon that separately in just a moment. And in a nutshell, it's all about improving the standards that apply to the domestic retrofit of energy efficiency measures, involving the quality of the job, the oversight of the job, and in a way of restoring confidence in both the sector and consumers' minds, and having a more consistent approach to the way that funding might operate to support developments, and in fact the way that the expectation that clients can have whenever they instruct work to be conducted commensurate with the standard. Where it essentially came about was off the back of the publication of the Each Home Counts review back in 2015. This was led up by a gentleman who was the head of the BRE at that point, who had very much had a look at what issues there were within the sector, and what could be done to best resolve those issues. So there had been a couple of government schemes that had come along that hadn't particularly delivered on what was expected, the Green Deal being one, for example. There was also a tendency for government funding to focus on a particular measure-led approach. So if the government funding was there for people to get cavity wall insulation done, then that's what you got, and that's what installers would then focus on delivering upon out there. But the Each Home Counts review published a set of 27 recommendations about what can be done to improve developments within this space, one of which was the introduction of a particular quality mark, which is now occupied by Trustmark, who act as an ultimate oversight of all works that take place within the PAS 2035 process. The methodology behind it very much focuses on that whole building approach. So no longer looking at single measures and what sort of funding might be available that can be maximised at that point. It's very much a focus on a whole building, so taking into account the combination of measures that can be installed within a property, what sort of sequence they're going to be installed in, what's most appropriate for the house, and interestingly, with these standards, what's right for the person living within the house. So rather than have this measure-led approach, it very much sets the scene for a plan being developed for a particular property over what's going to be done over the years ahead. There are a few mantras that will float about in this arena here, build tight, ventilate right being one of them. One of the interesting developments that's come from the PAS is the requirement to think ahead about what we're going to be doing to this property in the years to come. So, for example, if an air source heat pump is going to be fitted, perhaps an oil-fired combi boiler or a gas combi boiler is going to be ripped out, and a hot water cylinder is going to go in, are we perhaps best to look at a dual coil cylinder, for example, in anticipation of solar hot water being installed at a later date? So these are all the conversations that should be taking place at the start of the implementation of the PAS 2035 process, and a plan created that will reflect what's going to happen in the years ahead. One thing it also builds upon, as I mentioned, the importance of taking into account the person who's living in the property. It's all about tenant and homeowner engagement within the process. Sometimes that can be through a tenant liaison officer at a local authority or a housing association, for example, but it's gaining an understanding of how people actually use the energy within their property, but also to help educate them in terms of the best way that they can maximise reducing energy, reducing carbon, saving on bills, whatever the actual intended outcomes of the project is to begin with. And you'll see that quite commonly throughout the PAS 2035 process is a requirement for full transparency, full disclosure of all elements to it, particularly around the design and specification, and that's communicated to all parties throughout. The slides will be issued to you, and I'm conscious that some of them might be quite heavy with some of the content, but please feel free to obviously pick up with me separately. If you want to reach out, you can contact me through the Elmhurst website. The contact us functions up on the top right hand side. But when we look at various obligations that are out there in terms of the Fuel Poverty Act, now I must add a caveat to that first line there, that the metric that's used in Scotland to define fuel poverty is different from the rest of the nations of the UK. But either way, no matter what metrics used there, you'll see that with 23% of the population assessed as being in a position of fuel poverty, there's definitely an obligation for all of us to do something about that. We also have our legal obligation to achieve net zero by 2045 in Scotland, or 2050 in the UK. There's a slide coming up later that will show you some of the numbers that are involved in that process, some of the eye-watering numbers, but essentially 500,000 deep retrofits a year needed to the UK's housing stock. It's some number. But together with building more confidence within the eyes of the consumers out there, in terms of the energy efficiency sector, mainly as a result from the Each Home Counts review of some of the failures that have been there in the past. Quite recently, within the last few years, we had a situation with some high rises in Glasgow, for example, where the external wall insulation blew off in strong winds because it hadn't been secured correctly. We also saw that same year, in fact, with the same storm, the same situation happened over in Edinburgh at a school, whilst there were some kids at school that day. Thankfully, none of them were injured, but you can see these are the sort of things that can knock the industry somewhat. So there's no denying there is that strive towards building confidence in the eyes of consumers and introducing more enhanced quality standards to deliver upon that. Another wee reference slide for you at your leisure, but a lot of this is tied in with, this is more a UK government initiative around the green revolution across various sectors. And, even a cursory glance at social media on a daily basis, you'll see that particular areas will come under quite a bit of scrutiny and quite a lot of movement out there. So with energy, with buildings in the UK being responsible for around about 40% of the overall greenhouse gas emissions, you can see we all have quite a significant part to play within the built environment over what we can do to reduce that on our step and obligation towards net zero. A sister standard of the PAS, sometimes thought of as a sort of chapter in a book. So if PAS 2035 was the book, you could think of this as being a particular chapter within it. And this is PAS 2030, 2019. Now, this is the installer standard. So this mandates the standards that energy efficiency installers have to adhere to as part of the PAS 2035 mandatory compliance. Now, when I go through the roles within PAS 2035, I'll touch upon that slightly differently in terms of the certification process for installers and what sort of opportunities might be available for them. Obviously, that leads to then considerations around skills training and what we can do to develop the necessary supply chain that's going to be required to do these 500,000 retrofits a year. Now, I've put a slide in here from one of our fellow accreditation schemes, so you'll be familiar with UCAS, and I like the content. I like the way that they describe this, where they look at the distinction between accreditation and certification, and introduce the analogy of a quality assurance ladder. So a ladder of compliance. Now, certification is an audit of an organisation that they're conforming to the criteria that's laid out within certain standards or the scheme that they're a part of, whereas accreditation is a step further up the ladder, performing that oversight role across the entire process and even the competence of the certification process itself. And that becomes particularly relevant when we look at the roles and the responsibilities within PAS 2035. So when it was published, the PAS 2035 document introduced 5 roles, very clearly defined in terms of the responsibilities of the person who occupy those. Interestingly, the same person or the same company or the same representative of a company can actually occupy all 5 roles. Would you believe? Now, yes, admittedly, that can very often lead to questions over conflicts of interest, etc. But technically, there's nothing to prevent the same individual person occupying multiple roles within PAS 2035. The linchpin of the entire process, though, is that of the retrofit coordinator. So the retrofit coordinator acts as the project manager, if you like, throughout the process, and not just from start to finish. In actual fact, before the process commences, way back at the inception of it at the planning stage, all the way right through till after the work's been done, till after evaluation's been conducted. And in fact, in many ways, there's guidance there relating to the coordinator reaching out to individual tenants and homeowners months after the install to check everything's fine and that they don't have any issues with that. But the retrofit coordinator has the requirement and the obligation to sign off on PAS 2035 compliance throughout. Now, although that's predominantly a desk-based role, there is a bit of guidance relating to retrofit coordinators acting in a more boots-on-the-ground capacity and getting out to have a look at the work that's being conducted, especially when we look at the evaluation of what's been done. But generally speaking, the retrofit coordinator will base most of the decisions on what they're going to do following their discussions with the client on the work that's conducted by the retrofit assessor. Okay. Now, a retrofit assessor must be a domestic energy assessor. So they must be an accredited domestic energy assessor who's then upskilled to become a retrofit assessor. And the retrofit assessment itself is very, very similar to the process that takes place when a domestic energy assessor is out conducting an EPC or an energy performance report, in the sense that they'll do an RD/SAP assessment on the property, but they'll also have a conversation with the person living within the property to find out a bit more about how they use their energy to conduct what's known as an occupancy assessment. But they'll also report on the condition of the property and create a condition report which takes into account all parts of the property. It is a visual, non-intrusive inspection similar to an EPC, but they will gather that information together with detailed floor plans, site notes, and lots of photographs, and get that information over to the coordinator to give them plenty of detail to begin to formulate a plan. At that point, the coordinator will weigh up the options in discussion with the client. So they'll conduct what's known as an improvement options evaluation and decide what's going to be done, in what order are things going to be done, what that's going to involve. But the retrofit coordinator themselves might not be particularly competent to then begin to put together designs, and that then involves the engagement with someone acting as a retrofit designer. And there's someone who's deemed as competent to be able to design a particular element of the installation. So, for example, a heating engineer who's particularly skilled at installing systems, quite adept at heat loss calculations, for example. That's both pre-install and what it would be if there was additional insulation fitted within a property, for example. That person could be deemed as competent to put together the design for the coordinator to consider as part of the creation of a plan. A lot of the time, the design is actually done by the installer and the person who will ultimately be going on to fit the measure. Again, if they're deemed as competent to be able to design it, as they should be, one would like to think, by membership of various competent person schemes, then that should satisfy the requirements of the coordinator that they can use their designs as adequate for the medium-term plan that's created. Now, there is a fifth role that's mentioned there right at the top, the retrofit advisor. Now, there's a consultation on the go at the moment the BSI are hosting, where they're looking at a future iteration of PAS 2035. And it looks as though the retrofit advisor role may become no more. So the retrofit advisor was typically one that was aimed at, say, third-party or third-sector organisations, or people like the Energy Savings Trust, for example, who might have staff manning the phone lines dealing with frontline inquiries that are coming in, where that's someone who's competent to be able to give direct advice out to clients about this process and give them a nudge in the right direction. But as the rollout of PAS 2035's gathered a pace, we're actually finding that many times clients are actually approaching the retrofit coordinator in the first instance. So those are the specific roles that are there. The reason I've highlighted the retrofit coordinator and the retrofit assessor is that they are accredited positions. So someone has to be accredited to occupy and fulfill those roles. And that's where Elmhurst fits in. So we operate a retrofit coordinator and a retrofit assessor accreditation scheme. The other roles there, the designer and the installer, more relates to the individual person's competence. But part of the byproduct of Elmhurst's involvement within this, and obviously our market share and what have you, is that over recent months we've begun to receive a lot more inquiries through from installers about compliance with that part of the standard. And I must always add that caveat that if anyone comes to me with particular questions around ventilation, for example, and minimum standards when it comes to the install side, it might not be appropriate for me to answer that, as technically we're more focused on overseeing what's done by coordinators and assessors. That slide there will give an overview of what I've chatted through with you there in terms of the steps in the process. But the key takeaway is you'll see how much the coordinator is embedded within the process from start to finish. The retrofit assessment give you a highlight there of the various reports that are created, the RDSAP assessment, the condition report and the occupancy assessment, which then go towards formulating this retrofit plan for the property. Now, the plans themselves are lodged centrally with Trustmark, so they operate a data warehouse, which is designed to be this central repository, if you like, of retrofit plans, with the idea being that certain work might be done now, certain work might be planned for next year's budget or 5 years from now. So there should always be this central reserve where retrofit plans are stored, where clients can access and future retrofit coordinators can access as well. There is also more on the retrofit evaluation side, so post-install, to check compliance and make sure that the work that was planned has been done, as a way to minimise the performance gap, if you like. There is a requirement for some additional services to be conducted as a way of evaluating the work that's been done, which can involve thermography, air tightness testing and ventilation assessments, together with historic and protected buildings, compliance with, BS 7913 from memory. Now, I appreciate in the Borders area, similar to many predominantly rural areas of Scotland, that's a major consideration, and I'm more than happy to pick up on that separately with you offline. But any retrofit coordinator who's acting within the geographic area or for properties within it, I would expect that if that's likely to be a scenario they come across quite frequently, particularly for any pre-1919 properties, it's well worth just checking in with them if they have that additional layer of competence, because it is an additional qualification that's out there when we begin to look at historic and protected properties. So just a summary there about the data warehouse. I'm conscious time's marching on, so I better rattle through these a bit. The way that the roles can fit in with the existing occupation that people have, especially people from a trades background, can actually be quite interesting depending on what someone's plan is and how they would like to see themselves develop in the years ahead. So technical surveyors, people who are out there on a daily basis visiting properties, measuring up, specifying systems, they're actually in an ideal position to consider upskilling as a retrofit assessor, with the caveat that they would need to be a domestic energy assessor first. But that could represent a sort of one-stop shop service for them, particularly if they were looking at having their services contracted by one of the main contractors who might choose to engage with them to conduct retrofit assessments and technical surveys. Project managers fit in well with the coordinator role. Interestingly, it's not one where someone has to have a specific defined qualification to become a coordinator. It's more deemed by how competent they are and what experience they have within the industry, and potentially out with the industry, and any other credits that they have in place that could count towards being eligible for it. But one in particular, I'm conscious that the Supply Chain Forum has a number of tradespeople who are interested in expanding on what opportunities for them. One role, as I touched upon earlier, that could be of particular interest is around retrofit design. Gave the example of a heating engineer earlier who may be competent to design a heating system for a property. You may also have an electrician who's quite adept at knowing how best to install extractor fans that might be required to be fitted in as part of the PAS 2035 process to meet the ventilation requirements. There may even be someone else who's looking at internal wall insulation, who not only could see that as a potential cross-training opportunity for them to become trained up to go out there and install the measure, but also to actually help and specify the design for what's best to be done for that property and for the people within it. So the retrofit designer is an interesting role. It's not a job in and of itself that someone's going to go out there and apply for, if you like, but if a competent tradesperson offers their services out to a retrofit coordinator to be able to help specify the design for their particular area, then that's a definite opportunity for someone. That first part there, option one, touches on what I mentioned about someone upskilling to conduct it. The other option they have is to partner up essentially with an Elmhurst domestic energy assessor or retrofit assessor or retrofit coordinator for that matter, to negotiate some terms to work in partnership with them where they'll perhaps help on the technical survey aspect. If any particular members of the supply chain are interested in that, please reach out to me, because I'm always more than happy to help facilitate any discussions between like-minded organisations where I can certainly identify gaps from either side. In terms of the scale, we mentioned about 500,000 deep retrofits for the UK. Would you believe it's 113,000 a year in Scotland alone for the next 23 years? That's how many properties need to be retrofitted in order to meet our net zero obligations, never mind any other government targets that might exist from energy efficiency standards and social housing, or some of the private rented sector regulations that are on the horizon, and ultimately some of the owner occupied that are likely to come in the near future. It basically works out as a property a minute would have to be retrofitted between now and 2045, one property every minute for the next 23 years. Now, in terms of the funding and the schemes that are on the go at the moment, so PAS 2035 was introduced into ECO-funded works, ECO3 funded works as of July of this year, and will remain in place through ECO4 when that's introduced next year. Interestingly, back in February, the Scottish Government released the heat and building strategy, and within that, although that's at consultation stage, admittedly, they have stated within that it's their intention to have PAS 2035 adopted into all future delivery programmes. And we saw that quite recently with the release of the Procurement for Housing Scotland tender for the East 2 framework, which I believe actually goes live in the middle of October. Works within that have to be compliant with PAS 2035. Scotland Excel have got their £800 million framework out at the moment. Would you believe that's out for tender? Again, under PAS 2035. There have been south of the border some localised local authority delivery programmes, the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund being one. Again, in Scotland, we have various area-based schemes and things. So there's no denying that the PAS 2035 is here to stay. It's not going to go anywhere. It will likely evolve over time like everything. It is very much in its infancy in the sense that it's mainly only ECO that's the sort of mandatory national programme that it applies to at the moment, but there's no denying it is going to apply more widely in the years to come. Now, conscious time's marched on a bit, so I'll quickly just rattle through. In terms of Elmhurst, I often think of this, the sort of golden triangle, as I call it, in terms of what we actually offer. So although accreditation is the cornerstone of what we do, with around about 1 million EPCs that are lodged through Elmhurst every year, that's very much augmented by the services that we offer out there for training, whether that's existing Elmhurst members to become more and more competent in various other roles, or even if it's new starts coming to us to train to become a domestic energy assessor or retrofit assessor, for example. And we've also developed a whole suite of software that we produce in-house that's available for our members to assist in the creation of EPCs and retrofit assessments, etc. That slide there will give you the summary of the steps in the process for someone who's starting out or someone who's looking to upskill to qualify as either an assessor or a coordinator, and then what the steps are in the process to then become an accredited member and therefore competent person to be out to conduct the work itself, together with the various software packages that are on offer to assist in the production of retrofit assessments and retrofit coordinator medium-term plans. One thing there I'd like to highlight at the bottom is quite unique. At Elmhurst, we've built a tool where we allow energy assessors to convert an RDSAP assessment to a full SAP file, and then we focus on training retrofit coordinators to become conversant with the use of SAP methodology so that they can conduct far more accurate calculations around the creation of the medium-term plan when they're weighing up all the various options that are going into putting together the retrofit package of measures for the property. So we're the only scheme to offer that, and it's very much what differentiates us in the sense that we'll always encourage retrofit coordinators to be competent, not necessarily to be able to produce a U-value calculation that can then override defaults and RDSAP necessarily without some additional training, I might add, but at the same time have them totally conversant with that methodology to therefore be able to offer back the way to their clients future further sort of surety over how accurate they are with the numbers that they're crunching. There's a quick mention of some of the competency schemes that we offer. These are available, incidentally, on a standalone basis. I can predict a massive upswing in the months and years ahead around those, particularly around that bottom one, air tightness testing. Part of the PAS 2035 process involves a risk assessment in terms of the combination of measures that's likely to be installed, the number of properties, the plan that will apply throughout, and essentially they're graded from a risk path, path A, path B, or path C. If a property is deemed as a path C, there's a requirement for some mandatory air tightness testing to be done. Not always on each individual property. There might be an allowance for certain archetypes, but there's definitely a shortage of people who are competent air tightness testers out there. Elmhurst does operate a competency scheme for that called IATS. It's a UK-wide competency scheme for air tightness testing, and I can predict there's going to be quite a high demand for that in the months and years ahead as well. Lastly, this touches upon the various options that are available for organisations to become involved with Elmhurst, ranging from associate membership to strategic partnerships and alliances that we'll have, particularly with certain local authorities themselves, certain colleges that we are happy to work in partnership with. There are also some commercial interests there in terms of social housing providers and councils, depending how they would like to have an account set up with Elmhurst, whether they'd like to have full visibility over all the data that's being produced or whether that's outsourced to an Elmhurst member. I'm always happy to help advise and guide on that, because I'm quite a firm believer that it's very, very easy to instruct EPCs to issue out the tender to someone. A firm of our energy assessors maybe goes out and conducts that, but I really want to make sure that the infrastructure is in place in the background so that the ultimate client there, the end user, if you like, has full visibility over what's taking place. And I'm more than happy to pick up on that offline with anyone. A wee website, couple of websites at the top there, giving you a bit more information on what we've spoken about. As I mentioned, on the Elmhurst Energy contact page, you'll find my own details if you want to reach out to me. But that's just giving you a very generic overview. Sorry if I've slightly overrun on my time. I'm 7 minutes over time here, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you for listening, folks.